In this week's video, let's talk about these things that connect to your airline between your compressor and your airbrush. They're called moisture filters or moisture traps, and they're a very important part of any airbrush setup. They come in all different shapes and designs, but they're all made to do one thing, and that's to remove moisture and dust from your airline. And I'm not just going to tell you why these are so important. I'll show you a real-life example of why they're so necessary. When you compress air, moisture buildup is inevitable. When you turn your compressor on, air from the atmosphere is drawn into it, and this atmospheric air consists mainly of gases like nitrogen and the oxygen we breathe. But it also contains various vapors, dirt and dust, and of course water vapor. As a compressor compresses the air, it heats up, and hot air is going to hold more moisture than cold air. And as this compressed air naturally cools, the water vapor turns into water droplets through condensation. In other words, water is always going to build up in your compressor. And the easiest way to get rid of that water is by incorporating a moisture trap or a moisture filter into your airline. There are a bunch of different types that you can buy, but these that you see on the table right here are the ones that I use most often. This large one on the left side of the screen is made by Iwata, and these connect right onto your compressor, and they just work amazing at removing any sort of moisture. And these small ones are called pistol grip moisture filters, and they connect right before the airbrush. These are used like a last line of defense in case that initial filter does not get all the water out and some got in the hose. This will just prevent any of that from getting into the airbrush. An added benefit is that they add some stability to the hose, and it just makes the airbrush a bit easier to hold. That extra extension and size at the base of the airbrush makes it more comfortable to me. So let me show you a real life example of why these are so important. When I varnish a painting, I like to do it outside just to prevent any of that overspray from getting all in my studio. And I use an HVLP or an LVLP like this one here. And these use a lot more air than an airbrush at a higher PSI. So this is going to be kind of like a worst case scenario. I'm spraying the air out of the spray gun, just allowing the tank to refill itself a few times. And it's important to point out that this tank was completely dry and empty before I started this. And after only a few cycles of spraying air and letting the tank refill itself, you could see in the moisture trap that it's already starting to collect some water. I've noticed that this mainly happens in the summer on hot and humid days. So the area that you live in is going to play a big part in how much moisture you're going to have to deal with. If you're in a drier climate like Phoenix or New Mexico, you're not going to have as much moisture as you'll see here. But I live in New York where we have extremely dry winters and very humid summers. As I was filming this, the temperature outside was around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 32 Celsius, and the humidity was around 75%. What you're seeing here is from about 15 minutes of continued use, and it's a fair amount of water, and you definitely don't want this going into your airline. If water starts getting into the airline, you may start to notice an inconsistent and intermittent spray pattern, kind of where it starts and stops and tends to spit the paint. That moisture in the airline will also eventually mix with the paint itself as that paint is atomized, and that's just going to cause a bunch more problems. At the end of my airline where I connect my LVLP spray gun, I like to add an additional filter here just in case as a backup to remove any excess moisture. And you could see right here how well that Iwata filter did connected to the compressor. After about 15 minutes of spraying, you could see here that there's zero moisture in this, so that initial filter removed all of it. Now this isn't a video on airbrush compressors, but there are a few things that I want to talk about. The great thing about these small compressors today is that almost all of them include a moisture filter built right in with the air regulator. This is a very old one that I own that I keep as a backup. Still works just as well as it did on day one, and if any moisture builds up in this trap while the compressor's on, I can press this button at the bottom and that'll drain it. Before you go out and buy all different types of moisture filters, one of the best things you can do is buy a compressor that has a tank on it. Even a small tank like on this one right here does an incredible job at helping to collect that moisture. The droplets of water will collect and build up in the bottom of the tank, and then while the compressor is sitting on a flat surface, you can open this valve to drain it out. And if you want to extend the life of your compressor, you honestly should be doing this every day, especially if you live in a more humid climate. So not only will a tank help you get a more consistent and controlled PSI, which will eliminate that air pulsation that you see in cheaper, smaller compressors, the tank also kind of acts like a free moisture trap, collecting moisture at the bottom of the tank instead of directly forcing it into the airline. So although a tank is very helpful, it's still not a replacement for a real moisture trap. So if your compressor already has a moisture trap built into it, I'd recommend adding one of these into your airline. This one is made by Iwata, but I've used cheap ones for many years and they all work great. The one I'm replacing on my air hose right now is one made by Master. It's only like $6 or $7 and it still works very well. Just getting kind of old. It's like 4, maybe 5 years old, so I think it's a good time to replace it. The only thing more annoying than water in your airline is an air leak. So I recommend picking up some Teflon tape, which is a thread sealant made out of PTFE. These pistol grip air filters usually have a small gasket in them, but I still think it's a good idea just to add a small amount of Teflon tape. When you add Teflon tape to threads, you always want to make sure you're adding it on clockwise, so going in this motion to the right. This way when you screw it together, it's not going to bunch up. And you don't need to use much Teflon tape at all. Usually 1 to 2 wraps around is more than enough. And even if you have a very small amount of Teflon tape on those threads, it really works wonders. Just a small amount like this will prevent air leaks. I like to use these couplers, which act as quick adapters, and I add these onto all my airlines so my airbrushes can quickly attach to them. This is an important one to put Teflon tape on, so just like before, when you're looking at the threads straight on, you want to put this on clockwise, meaning going to the right. I'll put this on exactly like I did before, and if your thread tape is a bit too wide, you can use an X-Acto blade to clean it up. If they look like this, you're good to go. All you have to do is screw them together. Then I like to use a set of wrenches. This is an 11 and a 12 millimeter, and I'm not using these to tighten them down, just gripping it so I can get them snug. And if you don't have any sort of wrenches or adjustable wrenches, a pair of soft draw pliers like this works great too. And that's it for the end of my air hose. I have the moisture filter along with a quick coupler, quick adapter at the top of it. So this will just give me peace of mind knowing that no sort of contaminants or moisture are going to get into my airbrush. And the great thing about these quick adapters are they're universal, so I could use any airbrush on it. I have a bunch of airbrushes, so it's nice to switch over from Harder and Steenbeck over to Badger, like this Badger Patriot, and then over to an Iwata. And I just put these on all my airbrushes, usually just buying cheapo third-party ones. They work just fine, and I could swap my airbrushes out anytime I want. When you connect one of these larger moisture filters directly to your compressor, you want to do the same thing by putting Teflon tape on these threads. Now, when you add these to any compressor, you want to make sure that the cup that's used to collect the excess water is facing downward. In my studio setup, I use a much larger California air compressor, and on that one, I have my moisture filters and air regulator mounted outside the box that I built for it. And this is the way that these filters should face, pointing downwards. This way, if they end up collecting any water, you could press the bottom on each one of these and it'll let out any of that excess moisture. I've been using this setup for a few years now. It's worked great. I've never had any sort of moisture in my airline, and that's because I basically have 3 filters on it. The 2 you're seeing here, and then that small pistol grip one connected to the bottom of my airbrush. Going back to this smaller compressor, I'm screwing in this moisture trap using a wrench for grip. Again, just make sure that you don't over tighten anything. And then I'll take this small collection cup and then screw it onto the bottom of the moisture filter. You can see on this one, you can't place it completely vertically up and down because the tank's underneath it. But even if it's at a slight angle like it is here, it's still going to work just fine. So if you don't have an inline moisture filter like one of these, or a pistol grip one like this, I would definitely recommend picking up at least one of these and adding it into your setup. Knowing that you have clean and dry air going into your airbrush will keep it performing at its best and will make the process of painting much more enjoyable. If you live in a humid climate and you've dealt with excess moisture in your airline, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So I do hope that this video was helpful. And of course, I want to say thank you so much to these incredible people on the right side of the screen. These are the current channel members, and I want to thank you all so much for your generous support. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll be back here next Friday.